Jerusalem, the crossroads of faith for billions, became the center of global attention minutes ago. What happened has already drawn prayers from every continent. Religious leaders are speaking. Social media is overflowing. And one word keeps appearing again and again: sign. But before assumptions spread, we need to understand what actually happened. Stay with us. Give us a like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Jerusalem was not expecting disaster today. The afternoon had unfolded quietly. Pilgrims moved slowly through the narrow limestone streets of the old city. Vendors spoke in low voices beneath stone archways. Sunlight rested gently across ancient walls that have absorbed centuries of prayer, war, and waiting. Nothing in the sky suggested disruption. Nothing in the air hinted at danger. Then the ground shifted. It was not violent. There was no dramatic tearing of earth, no towering wave of dust racing across rooftops. Instead, it felt like a brief hesitation beneath the city, as if the stone itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. People stopped mid-step. Conversations broke off without explanation. A vibration passed through the pavement, subtle but unmistakable. Within seconds, windows rattled. In the open prayer areas near the sacred quarters, worshippers instinctively looked upward, not downward. The sky remained clear. No thunder. No aircraft overhead. Yet the tremor moved horizontally, rippling through the limestone foundations that support some of the oldest structures in the world. Then came the wind. Without warning, a sharp gust pushed through the narrow corridors of the old city, accelerating between stone walls like air forced through a canyon. Dust lifted suddenly from the ground. Loose sand spiraled upward in tight columns, stinging eyes and blurring vision. It lasted less than a minute, but long enough to turn calm into confusion. Emergency alerts did not activate immediately. Seismic monitors outside the city registered movement, but early readings were inconsistent. Some sensors detected a shallow disturbance. Others showed almost nothing at all. Social media filled faster than official data could respond. Videos appeared, short clips, capturing trembling lamps, swaying prayer books, startled crowds, gripping ancient stone for balance. Witnesses began using the same phrase. It didn't feel like an earthquake. For a city built upon layers of history, the integrity of the ground is not an abstract concern. Jerusalem's foundations are complex. Beneath visible streets lie tunnels, caverns, and archaeological layers stretching back thousands of years. A shallow shift, even a minor one, can travel unpredictably through these hidden spaces. What unsettled many was the location. The tremor appeared concentrated in the very heart of the city, where faith, history, and tension overlap within a few hundred meters. It was not a regional quake affecting surrounding suburbs equally. Reports from neighborhoods farther west described little to nothing, yet, in the old city, the sensation was clear enough to stop movement entirely. Emergency crews began scanning for structural stress fractures. Authorities asked crowds to move cautiously. Clergy and religious leaders urged calm, even as they themselves searched the faces of those around them for understanding. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to vigilance. Because in Jerusalem, even a small disturbance carries weight. And that is what made it heavier. Within minutes, international news outlets began running alerts. Unusual tremor in Jerusalem. Sacred sites report ground movement. Religious communities across continents began sharing footage, asking for updates, offering prayers before full details were known. And the world was only beginning to understand that this was not the end of the event. It was the beginning. The tremor had barely faded when the first crack appeared. It was thin at first, almost invisible against the pale limestone. A faint line running diagonally across a section of ancient wall near the prayer plaza of the western wall. For a few seconds, no one noticed. The crowd was still unsettled from the ground movement. Some were checking phones, others were whispering prayers under their breath. Then the stone shifted. A low grinding sound, deep, heavy, unmistakable, rose from within the wall itself. Not a surface crumble, not a pebble falling. This was internal movement, the kind that suggests weight redistributing after centuries of stillness. People stepped back instinctively. One block, massive, weathered, layered with generations of touch, tilted forward by mere centimeters. That was enough. Smaller stones beneath it dislodged first, striking the ground with sharp cracks that echoed across the plaza. The sound ricocheted off surrounding structures, amplifying the moment beyond its size. Then, the larger section gave way. It was not a total collapse. The wall still stood, but a portion, ancient, foundational, broke free and fell. Dust erupted upward, swallowing the lower prayer area in a gray cloud. Screams replaced silence. Prayer shawls scattered. People stumbled backward, some falling to their knees, not in devotion, but in shock. Cameras never stopped recording. Live streams captured the exact second stone met Earth. Viewers across continents watched ancient rock, believed by many to have survived empires' fracture before their eyes. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. This was not an apartment complex, not a modern tower. It was one of the most spiritually charged locations in the world. Structural engineers arriving on scene quickly assessed the damage. Preliminary observations suggested the tremor had destabilized already stressed segments. Jerusalem's limestone, though resilient, weakens over centuries through erosion, moisture shifts, and microfractures invisible to the naked eye. A subtle ground shift can magnify pressure points that have existed quietly for decades. But again, the timing unsettled observers. The collapse occurred minutes after a tremor that many sensors barely registered. The affected section was not previously flagged as critical, and the failure appeared concentrated in one symbolic zone within meters of thousands gathered in prayer. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed they heard a second vibration just before the fall. Others insisted there was a flash of light reflected off the stone. Authorities urged restraint, emphasizing structural stress as the likely cause. Experts spoke of load-bearing calculations, sediment shifts, and historical wear. Yet the emotional weight was undeniable. The Western Wall is more than masonry. It is memory embedded in rock. It is the last visible remnant of the Second Temple complex, an anchor point for Jewish identity across centuries of exile and return. Pilgrims press written prayers into its crevices. Tears have soaked its surface. Generations have faced it in hope. To see part of it fall, however limited, the damage felt larger than physics. Nearby, along the eastern ridge, observers on the slopes of the Mount of Olives reported small surface fractures appearing in the ground. Hairline splits in pathways that had not existed earlier in the day. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to deepen unease. Engineers began scanning for additional instability beneath the broader sacred plateau, including areas approaching the Temple Mount. Officials were careful with language. They spoke of localized structural compromise. They avoided speculation. But the footage told its own story. Ancient stone had moved. Sacred architecture had yielded. And it had happened within minutes of a tremor that barely announced itself. As rescue teams worked and dust slowly settled over the plaza, one realization grew heavier. This was no longer just a natural disturbance. The ground had shifted, and history had felt it. If the tremor unsettled the city, and the collapse shook its heart, what happened next unsettled something deeper. Because several recordings captured something that did not fit neatly into either explanation. Minutes before the stone section gave way near the western wall, a faint vertical glow appeared in the background of at least 3 separate videos. It lasted no more than 4 seconds. Thin, pale, almost like a column of mist reflecting sunlight, but the sky at that moment was clear, and the angle of light did not align with reflection. Most viewers missed it the first time. Only after the footage was replayed slowed frame by frame did people begin pointing to it. The glow seemed to rise briefly from behind the upper stones, then vanish just before the first grinding sound was heard. Officials have not confirmed it. Some analysts suggest it could have been dust catching direct light during the tremor. Others propose lens distortion or compression artifacts from mobile devices. These explanations are plausible. They are consistent with physics. But the timing remains difficult to ignore. At nearly the same moment, audio sensors positioned beneath sections of the old city registered a low-frequency vibration too deep for human hearing, but detectable on specialized equipment used for structural monitoring. It did not match the seismic signature of the earlier tremor. It was shorter, concentrated, almost like a pulse. No explosion was detected. No machinery was operating below ground. Yet the waveform exists. In addition, several witnesses in the plaza described what they called a pause before the collapse. Not silence in the normal sense, but a sudden dampening of ambient sound. Birds that had been circling above disappeared from view seconds before the stones fell. Conversations seemed to flatten, as if air pressure had subtly shifted. There is no verified atmospheric anomaly recorded at that exact minute. Still, multiple testimonies share similar wording. It felt like something held its breath. Even more unusual were reports from a monitoring station near the Temple Mount. One sensor briefly lost signal during the tremor, not due to power failure, but due to an unexplained data interruption lasting precisely 2.8 seconds. Engineers are investigating whether it was a technical glitch or electromagnetic interference. 8. So far, no definitive cause has been announced. Experts caution against overinterpretation. In high-stress environments, perception sharpens but also distorts. When symbolic locations are involved, the human mind instinctively searches for pattern and meaning. Dust becomes light. Sound becomes omen. And yet, when separate anomalies converge, visual irregularity, unexplained acoustic pulse, sensor disruption, questions naturally follow. Individually, each detail may have a rational explanation. Together, they form a sequence. Tremor, glow, pulse, collapse. Some religious commentators have already drawn connections to ancient texts describing light, shaking ground, and shifting stone in moments of divine intervention. Others insist such interpretations risk overshadowing the real human impact, the injuries, the fear, the fragility of infrastructure. Both responses are unfolding simultaneously. Scientists are analyzing footage. Clergy are calling for prayer. Social media is splitting between skepticism and reverence. What is undeniable is this: the collapse did not feel random to those who stood there. Whether that perception reflects physical causation or emotional gravity remains under investigation. But in Jerusalem, a city where stone and symbolism are inseparable, even small irregularities carry amplified meaning. And tonight, as rescue lights illuminate fractured rock and dust settles over sacred ground, the unanswered details continue to circulate. Was it coincidence? Was it convergence? Or was it simply the kind of rare alignment of natural forces and human perception that history later remembers as something larger than it first appeared? The investigation has only begun, and the world is still watching. Within 10 minutes of the collapse, Jerusalem was no longer the only city holding its breath. News alerts moved faster than official briefings. Live stream clips from the plaza near the Western Wall were shared across continents before emergency statements were fully drafted. Dust rising against ancient stone became the image of the hour. Commentators began speaking over shaky footage, trying to interpret what viewers had just witnessed. And almost immediately, the tone shifted from curiosity to prayer. In Rome, candles were lit beneath the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. In New York, interfaith leaders gathered in Lower Manhattan for an unscheduled vigil. In small congregations across Asia and South America, pastors paused mid-sermon to acknowledge the event unfolding in Jerusalem. The phrase, "Pray for Jerusalem," began trending globally. Governments issued statements of concern. Archaeological authorities called for calm and emphasized the importance of preserving historical integrity. Religious leaders, however, spoke differently. Some framed the moment as a reminder of fragility of stone, of certainty, of human control. Others used a stronger word: warning. International media outlets replayed the sequence again and again. First the tremor reports, then the slow-motion collapse, then the frame-by-frame analysis of the faint vertical glow, captured seconds before impact. Panels of experts debated geological plausibility, while theologians referenced centuries of expectation tied to the city's sacred geography. The location mattered. Jerusalem is not simply a capital or a tourist destination. It is a focal point of layered belief, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, compressed into a few square kilometers. When something shifts here, it does not remain local. It becomes symbolic by default. Crowds began gathering outside embassies. Prayer chains formed online. Live stream platforms saw millions join simultaneous moments of silence. In some places, church bells rang without coordination, spontaneous, not scheduled. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, floodlights illuminated the damaged section of the wall. Engineers worked carefully, documenting fractures and stabilizing adjacent stones. Medical teams continued assessing minor injuries. The practical response was focused, technical, grounded. But beyond the physical damage, something intangible was spreading. The convergence of three elements: a tremor with inconsistent readings, a sacred structure partially collapsing, and unexplained anomalies captured on camera, created a narrative larger than the sum of its parts. Whether accurate or amplified, it resonated. Financial markets briefly fluctuated in response to regional uncertainty. Travel advisories were reviewed. Pilgrimage groups reconsidered itineraries. The ripple effect moved outward in widening circles. And through it all, one question echoed across broadcasts and comment sections alike: why Jerusalem? Why now? Some commentators urged restraint, reminding audiences that ancient structures require constant maintenance and that seismic microactivity is not uncommon in the region. Others noted that symbolism can distort proportion, that a minor structural failure becomes monumental when attached to sacred ground. Both views gained traction, yet the emotional reaction remained unmistakable. In cities thousands of miles away, strangers stood together in silence for people they would never meet. Synagogues, churches, and mosques opened doors outside regular hours. The world, often divided in its view of Jerusalem, momentarily converged in shared concern. The event had moved beyond geology. It had entered consciousness. And as night fell over the city, with rescue lights reflecting off ancient limestone and investigators reviewing digital evidence, one reality became clear: Jerusalem was no longer responding alone. The world had stepped in, watching, analyzing, praying, trying to understand whether this was simply a tragic convergence of natural forces, or the beginning of something history would remember differently. PHNV, the deeper question. By nightfall, the dust had settled. Floodlights illuminated fractured stone near the western wall. Engineers marked stress lines in chalk. Drones hovered briefly, mapping the damage from above. The plaza, once filled with shock and confusion, was now controlled and measured. On the surface, the sequence could be summarized clearly: a tremor, a structural failure, a set of unusual visual and acoustic anomalies. Each element, examined separately, carries precedent. Jerusalem sits near an active fault system. Ancient limestone weakens over time. Digital sensors and cameras occasionally produce irregular artifacts under stress. Nothing, in isolation, demands a supernatural explanation. And yet, history is rarely shaped by isolated events. It is shaped by convergence. The tremor alone would have made local headlines. The partial collapse alone would have triggered structural investigations. The faint glow alone might have been dismissed as compression distortion. But together, occurring within minutes, in one of the most symbolically charged locations on Earth, they formed a pattern difficult for many to ignore. Jerusalem has endured destruction before. Entire walls have fallen, temples have been razed, empires have left their mark in ash and rubble. Compared to those chapters, today's damage is limited. But symbolism does not measure size. It measures meaning. For believers, sacred ground carries memory embedded in stone. When that stone shifts unexpectedly, it resonates beyond physics. It touches expectation, prophecy, warning, renewal, judgment, hope. Not because data demands it, but because history has trained the human mind to look for layers beneath visible events. For scientists, the responsibility is different. Convergence does not equal causation. Geological stress accumulates quietly for decades. Structural vulnerabilities hide behind centuries of repair. Sensor irregularities require technical review before interpretation. Extraordinary meaning demands extraordinary evidence. Both responses are unfolding side by side tonight. In one room, structural engineers review load distribution models. In another, religious leaders read ancient texts aloud under candlelight. Outside, cameras continue broadcasting fractured limestone to millions of screens. Three possibilities now stand before the world. First, this was a geological reminder, an intersection of natural forces and aging architecture, magnified by the sacred geography of its location. Second, it was a warning about fragility not divine, but human, a signal that preservation, maintenance, and vigilance are more urgent than ever in a city built upon layers of history. Third, and this is the question many are quietly asking, it was something that cannot yet be reduced to data alone. Not necessarily supernatural, not necessarily prophetic, but an alignment of timing, place, and anomaly that feels larger than coincidence. The most honest answer tonight is this: we do not yet know. Investigations will continue. Structural assessments will be released. Audio pulses will be analyzed. The faint column of light will be dissected, frame by frame. But regardless of what those findings conclude, something irreversible has already happened. The world paused. Jerusalem shifted not only in stone, but in collective awareness. Billions were reminded, within minutes, that even the most ancient foundations rest on moving ground. And perhaps that is the deepest message of all. Note: sacred places are not immune to physics. History is not immune to fracture. Faith is not immune to questions. Whether this moment will be remembered as tragedy, warning, coincidence, or sign depends not only on what investigators discover, but on how humanity chooses to respond. Tonight, Jerusalem stands wounded, watched, and illuminated. And the question remains suspended in the air, heavier than dust, quieter than tremor. Was this simply an event, or the beginning of something we have yet to understand? Long after the tremor faded, long after the fractured stones were stabilized, another signal began to circulate. It did not come from a sensor. It did not rise from ancient limestone. It came in the form of a carefully worded advisory. Given ongoing regional tensions, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem reiterated standard guidance: exercise good personal security practices, remain prepared, review travel plans, and make appropriate decisions for families. On the surface, this was routine language. Diplomatic missions around the world regularly issue such reminders. Preparedness is not panic. Caution is not alarm. And yet, timing matters. When advisory language is released immediately after a highly visible event in a city like Jerusalem, it carries a weight that extends beyond procedure. It signals not that something catastrophic has begun, but that unpredictability has entered the equation. Jerusalem is not an isolated city. It exists at the crossroads of faith, politics, history, and identity. Even events that begin as purely physical disturbances can ripple outward in ways that are difficult to forecast. That is why preparedness becomes part of the story. The embassy's message did not reference symbolism. It did not speculate about causes. It did not draw theological conclusions. Instead, it focused on personal responsibility, know your surroundings, review contingency plans, anticipate possible disruptions. Crises can happen unexpectedly while traveling or living abroad. A good plan helps you think through potential scenarios. It was language grounded in practicality. But practicality itself can be revealing. When authorities encourage people to review travel plans, they are acknowledging that secondary effects are possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Transportation interruptions. Temporary closures. Public gatherings. Heightened security presence. In highly symbolic environments, perception can move as quickly as facts. Within hours of the structural collapse near the Western Wall, images had circulated globally. Commentary followed. Interpretations multiplied. Some voices emphasized geology. Others emphasized meaning. The diversity of reaction itself created momentum. And momentum, if unmanaged, can influence stability. Preparedness advisories are designed to interrupt that momentum before it escalates. They function as stabilizers. They remind individuals to remain calm, informed, and deliberate. The key word is deliberate. Jerusalem has endured centuries of tension and coexistence. Its sacred sites are layered not only with history, but with deeply held belief systems. Events that occur in or near these locations are often interpreted through multiple lenses at once. In such contexts, clarity becomes essential. Security language serves clarity. It shifts the focus from speculation to action, from symbolism to safety, from narrative to preparedness. Importantly, the advisory did not indicate imminent danger. It did not announce evacuation. It did not signal crisis-level escalation. It simply emphasized awareness. Awareness is not fear. It is readiness. Still, the presence of such guidance influences global perception. News outlets often attach embassy statements to coverage, reinforcing the sense that an event has moved beyond local scope. Investors, travelers, and international observers take note. The effect is subtle but measurable. Airlines may review schedules. Tour groups may pause departures, pending updates. Families abroad may call loved ones to check in. None of these responses signal instability by themselves, but together they reflect how interconnected modern response has become. The physical event was localized. The reaction was global. Preparedness advisories also acknowledge an important truth. Crises are rarely defined solely by their initial cause. They are shaped by how communities respond. A tremor does not automatically produce unrest. A structural failure does not automatically trigger conflict, but uncertainty, if left unmanaged, can amplify tension. By encouraging travelers to review plans and consider potential disruptions, the embassy message effectively placed control back into individual hands. It reframed the moment, not as something overwhelming, but as something navigable with foresight. That shift matters, because in situations charged with symbolism, emotional reactions can sometimes outpace evidence. Preparedness slows that process. It creates space for investigation to proceed without escalation. Meanwhile, local authorities in Jerusalem focused on structural assessments, medical care, and site stabilization. International partners monitored developments, but refrained from dramatic declarations. In many ways, this is what responsible crisis management looks like. Calm acknowledgement, measured guidance, continuous monitoring. The advisory also underscores the layered nature of modern cities like Jerusalem. Beneath visible landmarks lie complex infrastructures, transportation routes, communication networks, residential neighborhoods, tourism corridors. Even minor disruptions in one zone can create temporary ripple effects in others. Preparedness does not assume worst-case outcomes. It prepares for variability. And variability is the defining feature of unpredictable events. In the hours following the announcement, global attention remained intense but orderly. Prayer gatherings continued. Analysts debated geological data. Engineers documented stone fractures. Religious leaders encouraged unity rather than alarm. The world watched, but it did not erupt. That distinction is important. Jerusalem's history contains chapters where symbolic events escalated rapidly. Today's response, by contrast, reflected a different era, one of instantaneous communication, but also coordinated stabilization. Security advisories are part of that stabilization architecture. They do not predict chaos. They aim to prevent it. In a city where physical ground and symbolic ground overlap so tightly, preparedness serves as a bridge between the two. It acknowledges that while interpretation varies, safety must remain constant. As night deepened over the old city, additional lighting illuminated inspection zones near the Temple Mount and surrounding areas. Monitoring systems were recalibrated. Engineers reviewed structural integrity reports. The atmosphere, though serious, was controlled. Travelers adjusted plans where necessary. Residents remained attentive but steady. The advisory's tone, measured, procedural, helped set that pace. It reminded observers that not every dramatic image signals cascading instability. Sometimes it signals the need for thoughtful readiness. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded within Part 6. The earlier sections of this unfolding story explored tremors, collapse, and unexplained phenomena. They examined convergence and symbolism. They raised questions that extend beyond data. This section grounds those questions. It demonstrates how modern institutions respond not to speculation, but to responsibility, how preparedness can coexist with faith, how caution can coexist with calm. Jerusalem tonight stands illuminated not only by floodlights over fractured stone, but by the layered systems designed to preserve order. Preparedness is not prophecy, it is prudence. And in a city where meaning can move as quickly as stone, prudence may be the most stabilizing force of all. The event began with movement beneath the ground. It evolved into fracture within sacred architecture. It generated global prayer and inquiry. And it concluded for now with a reminder that vigilance and composure remain the most reliable responses to uncertainty. The stones will be studied. The data will be analyzed. Interpretations will continue. But the advisory message remains simple. Be aware. Be prepared. Move forward carefully. In a city built upon centuries of tension and resilience, that guidance may be less dramatic than a tremor, but far more enduring.
هذا رسول الله حبيب الله أشرف خلق الله أعظم العالمين.
بحر الكويت الآن. يا سبحان الله.
نتيجة الحفريات بنشوف التشققات في أماكن مختلفة وأثرها الكبير على متانة المباني وعلى
Something unusual has begun unfolding in Jerusalem quietly, layer by layer. Within a short span of time, observers reported a moving beam of light above the Temple Mount, shifting quietly as prayers rose below. Days later, the ground along the Mount of Olives revealed a narrow fracture, followed by a brief vibration of ancient stones near the sealed Golden Gate, detected without any recorded earthquake. Then, in the silence of the night, a deep trumpet-like sound echoed from beneath the streets of the old city. Individually, each event can be explained. But together, they form a pattern touching the sky, the ground, the structures, and the hidden spaces below, raising a single question: are these isolated disturbances, or the early stages of a message unfolding? Before we dive into details, please consider liking this video and pressing the subscribe button. Every contribution does great things. Thank you very much. Imagine this. Just after evening prayers, a narrow beam of light formed high above the Temple Mount. At first, many assumed it was a military aircraft passing overhead, or simply a reflection of powerful spotlights from nearby tourist areas shining into the night sky. But within minutes, observers noticed something unusual. The light did not remain still. It moved. What drew the most attention was the way it moved. Each time groups gathered in prayer, The beam seemed to shift slowly, gliding from one section of the mount to another, pausing as voices rose, then continuing again when the prayers quieted. People watching from nearby rooftops and streets recorded the same pattern. When prayer lines formed, the light hovered. When they dispersed, it drifted forward again. It did not flash randomly or scatter across the clouds. It held its shape thin, bright, and steady, moving with a rhythm that felt connected to the moments unfolding below. For a city where every sighting carries memory, the sight stirred deep reflection. Ancient scripture speaks of light not only as illumination, but as a sign of divine attention, a signal that something is about to unfold, rather than something that has already arrived. Throughout the Old Testament, moments of turning, repentance, or collective prayer were often marked not by chaos, but by quiet signs led by light. In Isaiah 60:1, it is written, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." The verse does not describe destruction or chaos. It describes the start of illumination, the moment when attention is first drawn upward before the next events begin to appear. And that, the sky, was only the beginning. Within days, attention quietly shifted from what appeared above the city to what began to appear along its eastern ridge, where the ground itself seemed to reveal the next sign. After the recent disturbances, Jerusalem did not fully return to its usual quiet. Attention slowly shifted eastward, toward the slopes of the Mount of Olives, an area watched closely for both historical and geological reasons. There, survey teams and local observers reported the appearance of a narrow ground fracture that had not been visible before. At first glance, it looked small, almost easy to dismiss, but its location quickly drew interest. The crack did not form near the large Jewish burial areas that cover much of the mountain. Instead, it appeared at a distance from the main tomb sections, emerging along a stretch of land close to the ancient pathway, long associated with the route Jesus once walked when entering Jerusalem. This detail immediately caught public attention, not because of its size, but because of where it appeared away from heavily eroded burial slopes, yet near one of the most historically remembered routes in the region. Geologists who examined the site offered cautious explanations. According to several field specialists, such fractures can occur when shallow limestone layers gradually shift after seasonal moisture changes or minor underground pressure adjustments. However, what they noted as unusual was the direction of the fracture. For many residents, the discovery stirred reflection because the Mount of Olives has long held symbolic meaning tied to moments of transition and expectation. The Old Testament contains a striking passage connected directly to this very mountain. In Zechariah 14:4, it is written, "On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west." The verse describes a dramatic future event, far greater than any small surface fracture. And the ground did not remain the final layer to respond. Each of these events can be explained or dismissed. But when signs begin appearing across different layers of the same city above it, within it, and beneath it, the conversation changes. What once seemed isolated begins to form alignment. Now a different layer had shifted within the same period of time, not violently, but noticeably enough to interrupt routine. Not far from this eastern ridge, along the sealed entrance known as the Golden Gate, another quiet development soon drew attention from the stones themselves. While unusual signs in the sky and ground captured public attention, something far quieter was reported at ground level near the Golden Gate, one of the most historic entrances to Jerusalem's eastern wall. Visitors and maintenance staff described a brief but noticeable sensation. Several ancient stone slabs surrounding the sealed gate seemed to vibrate very lightly for a few seconds, then return to stillness. What made the event unusual was the absence of any seismic confirmation. Regional monitoring stations detected no P waves or S waves, the primary signals normally recorded during even the smallest earthquakes. Traffic logs showed no heavy vehicles passing nearby at the time, and no construction or drilling activity was underway within the surrounding district. The motion was extremely localized, brief, and limited to a small cluster of ancient paving stones directly adjacent to the gate. Geologists who reviewed the reports offered several cautious possibilities. Some suggested that shallow microstress adjustments within the limestone foundation could occasionally release very small pulses of energy, too weak to register on distant seismic equipment, but still strong enough to produce a short surface vibration in a confined area. What stood out to researchers was not the strength of the motion, but its narrow range and the lack of any continuing after effects. For many observers, however, the symbolic setting gave the incident a deeper emotional weight. The Golden Gate has remained sealed for centuries, surrounded by stones that have witnessed empires rise and fall. In the Old Testament, Habakkuk 2:11 contains a striking image. The stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork will answer it. The passage speaks poetically of silent structures becoming witnesses when human voices fail to speak truth. Seen purely through science, the brief vibration can be explained as a small, localized, geological adjustment, yet the setting invites reflection. Stones, usually seen as lifeless and unmoving, briefly became the center of attention not through noise, but through motion. And in a place where history, faith, and memory are built almost entirely from stone, even the faintest movement can feel like a reminder that the ground beneath the city is never completely silent. The way into the people of God is through understanding the story of God's dealings with His people all through the history of Scripture, and becoming a part of that story through Israel's Messiah, Jesus. Soon afterward, residents within the old city began reporting something that could not be seen at all, only heard echoing through the night like a distant horn rising from beneath the streets. Among the many unusual reports connected to Jerusalem, one of the most discussed in recent nights has not come from light or fire, but from sound. Residents and visitors inside the old city have described hearing a deep, low tone echoing through the streets long after midnight, a sound many compared to a distant trumpet blowing from somewhere beneath the ground. The tone did not resemble traffic noise, machinery, or aircraft. Witnesses described it as steady, hollow, and heavy, as if air were moving through a vast underground chamber. It lasted only a short time each night, sometimes less than a minute, yet strong enough to be heard across several nearby quarters before fading into silence. Several individuals offered similar accounts. A night security guard stationed near one of the stone gates said the sound seemed to rise from below the pavement rather than from the sky. A shop owner living above his closed store reported waking suddenly to what he first believed was a ceremonial horn, only to realize that no procession or event was taking place. A visiting traveler staying in a small guest house near the Armenian Quarter described the vibration accompanying the sound as soft but real, saying the window frame trembled slightly while the tone passed. Despite these consistent testimonies, local monitoring stations recorded no seismic disturbance, and no scheduled construction or underground blasting was reported during the same hours. Geologists reviewing the reports suggested that certain underground cavities beneath the old city, many of them ancient tunnels, cisterns, and carved chambers, can occasionally channel moving air or distant vibrations in ways that amplify low-frequency sounds. When pressure differences build between connected underground spaces, air can rush through narrow openings, producing tones that resemble deep horns or distant trumpets. Such acoustic effects are rare but possible in areas with layered stone and extensive hidden passages. Still, researchers acknowledged that determining the exact source would require detailed underground acoustic mapping that has not yet been conducted in the historic district. For many observers, the symbolism of the sound has drawn attention as much as the sound itself. In the Old Testament, the trumpet often marked moments of gathering, warning, or transition. Joel 2:1 declares, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain." In ancient times, the trumpet was not merely music. It was a signal that something significant was happening, calling people to awareness, to assembly, or to preparation. Whether the nighttime tone has a natural acoustic explanation or remains temporarily unexplained, the consistency of the reports has left many residents quietly watchful. In a city built above layers of ancient stone, tunnels, and chambers that have carried echoes for thousands of years, even a brief sound rising from the depths can feel powerful. Not loud, not destructive, just a deep note in the darkness, reminding those who hear it how thin the line can be between silence and signal. What is the significance of Jerusalem in religion? Jerusalem is not an ordinary landscape. It is a place where history is compressed into short distances, where sites separated by only a few streets carry meaning shaped over thousands of years. Because of this, timing and placement often matter as much as the events themselves. When unusual developments occur along the same eastern corridor of the city, near the Temple Mount, the ancient gates, and the slopes that overlook them, they naturally draw deeper attention than similar events occurring elsewhere. The significance of Jerusalem in the Abrahamic tradition is that it was King David's capital city, and it was the location where King Solomon built the first temple, at least according to the books of Samuel and Kings in the Bible. The story in the Bible continues after that point, and 400 years later the first temple and the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. This event is corroborated by extra-biblical and archaeological records. Many of the Judahites were sent into exile in Babylon at that point, and the Bible claims this to be the will of God. The biblical narrative and historical record does not end there, though. The Babylonians are conquered by the Persians under King Cyrus, and many of the Judahites returned from exile and constructed a second temple in Jerusalem. This temple stood for another 400 to 500 years, until was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. This is why Jerusalem is important in Judaism, and it's from this tradition that Jerusalem also gains its importance in Christianity and Islam. In Christianity, Jerusalem is the site of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In Islam, Jerusalem is the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. And significantly, at the location of the temple now sits the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, regarded as the third holiest location in all of Islam. What is striking is not the size of the disturbances, but their sequence. None of them have been catastrophic. None have reshaped the skyline or forced evacuations. Instead, they have appeared quietly, almost carefully, one after another, touching different parts of the same historic zone. First, attention was drawn upward. Then the ground revealed tension. And as observers continued watching, the question slowly began to change from, "What is this event?" to, "Why are several different layers of the city responding at the same time?" Patterns rarely announce themselves loudly at the beginning. They assemble gradually, piece by piece, until the repetition becomes difficult to ignore. And when multiple signals, light, stone, and shifting ground emerge within the same narrow window of time, even cautious observers begin to wonder whether the city is experiencing isolated incidents or the early stages of something forming beneath the surface that has not yet fully revealed itself. Since Jerusalem plays such a major role in Jewish tradition and in the Jewish imagination as a symbol, it's hard to generalize, but I would say its significance is primarily religious. To understand the religious significance, one has to have some familiarity with basic Jewish religious concepts. Judaism holds that God is everywhere, that he has no body or material aspect, and yet he has chosen a place for his presence to dwell. Dwell, in quotes, and that place is Jerusalem. Yet how can we understand dwell as applied to a God that is everywhere? It's a paradox to think that a God who is everywhere can dwell somewhere, so we need explanations. Perhaps that dwelling is merely a concentration where his presence becomes manifest and can be felt more intensely, or dwelling can be understood as the designation of a spot, an address, so to speak, to serve as a focal point for worship. It cannot be taken literally, and yet it is. God dwells in Jerusalem. This is combined with a commandment to build him a house there, the Jerusalem temple. Here the idea of concentration becomes clearer. We learn from the prophet Isaiah that the whole earth is full of God's glory, is 6-3. Even so, Israel is the holy land. Jerusalem is the holy city, Mount. Zion is the holy mountain, the temple is the holy sanctuary, and a small room inside the temple, the Holy of Holies, is the most sacred spot on earth, for God's presence dwells there. Many additional components add to the religious significance of Jerusalem, such as the belief that the temple is built on the same spot where Abraham sacrificed a ram in place of his son Isaac, that Jacob wrestled with an angel there and saw a ladder ascending to heaven from Jerusalem, and most importantly, that out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, as the prophet Micah foretold. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The Torah will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Micah 4-2. Taken together, the religious significance of Jerusalem in Judaism is unparalleled and unalterable. What would happen if we interpreted everything in the vision as a description not of their place, but of the people themselves? And what then happens if we use that as a way of imagining the destiny of the people of God in the current day? The reason for asking these questions comes from some writing I have been doing in the last couple of months. I was asked to write a short study booklet of around 15,000 words on Revelation for small groups meeting for 6 sessions. And for the final session, I was once more reading Rev 21 and was struck forcibly by the opening claim John makes at the start of this vision. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Rev 21.2. There is no doubt that the use of bride is a personal metaphor for the people of God. It has been used earlier in Revelation to signify the people of God, the saints or holy ones, as they experience oppression in the 42 months of their wilderness wanderings between the exaltation of Jesus and his return. The Gentiles will trample it. 11-2. And previous use of the personal metaphor of the people of God as the bride in 19-7-8 identifies the adornment of her fine clothing as the righteous acts of God's people, which connects this vision to the earlier, less developed nuptial imagery of 14-4-5. The personal adornment and the jewels of the city are neatly connected by the background text Isa 61-10, where the bride adorns herself with jewels. But there is another reason why we might press the city imagery to be that of a people rather than a place. John also emphasizes that the city is the dwelling place of God, Rev 21.3, and the fact that the city is a cube, thus looking like an enormous Holy of Holies in the temple, confirms this. But with the anticipated, recalled, destruction of the physical temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, the NT consistently transfers temple language to the new covenant Israel of God, that is, the Jewish Gentile followers of Jesus. Thus, Jesus declares his own body to be the new temple presence of God in the world in John 2:1-9a, claim picked up at his trial in Mark 14.58. Paul develops his metaphor of the followers of Jesus as his body from his Damascus Road encounter. Why are you persecuting me? So that both the community and individuals within it are God's temple and his dwelling place. 1 Cor 3.16-17, 1 Cor 6.19. In fact, Paul goes so far as to actually draw on the exact OT image that John makes use of in Rev 21. What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. 2 Cor 6.15. Paul is here making an ethical appeal to the Corinthians on the basis of the spiritual understanding of the ecclesia as the holy dwelling place of God. But what is fascinating here is that he is drawing on a range of OT texts. Firstly, he is drawing from Lev 26.12, which is the promise looking forward to the settlement of the people in the promised land. But then he is also drawing on Jer 32.38 and Ezek 37.27, which are both repurposing this future promise to look forward to the end of exile and the restoration of God's kingly rule over his people when they are restored to that land. And here's the thing, this is the move that Revelation is constantly making, combining promises of the Exodus with promises of the end of exile. This is found most clearly in the use of the equivalent time periods 3.5 years, 42 months, and 1,260 days that we find in chapters 11 and 12. The number 42 corresponds to the desert wanderings, since the total time in the desert is 42 years if you include the sojourn at Kadesh Barnea, and the people stop at 42 places listed in Num 33. But John's calculation using perfect months of 30 days each makes this equivalent to the time of tribulation in Daniel 7.25 and 12.7. For John, the followers of Jesus are both in a time of Exodus wanderings, heading towards the promised land, and in a time of tribulation, as they await final deliverance, which is first enacted by Jesus' death and resurrection, but only completed with the descent of the holy city. And for Paul, these promises are clearly fulfilled in Jesus. The question then arises, can we read the vision of the holy city completely in those personal terms, as people rather than place? There are good reasons in the text for moving from city as people to city as place. Stephen Pattimore, in his monograph, The People of God in the Apocalypse, SNTS, monograph, Series 128, 2004, notes some of the reasons, principally the nature of the metaphorical language, particularly in the second half of the vision. So what does happen when we press this to be a personal vision of the people of God rather than a place? The city is on a great, high mountain. Rev 21.1. The people of God are visible, like a city on a hill. Matt 5.14. And they draw all sorts of people to them. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. Rev 21.11. The attractiveness of the people is due only to the presence and glory of God in their midst, and it is this which draws people, rather than any particular quality of its own. Jasper has characterized the appearance of the One on the throne in the opening vision of heavenly worship in Revenued 4.3. So the people of God look stunning and impressive to the extent to which their passes owe. Character reflects the character of God, and they are to have a transparency about them. The idea of being clear as crystal suggests that there is no pretense. The city has great high walls. Rev 21.1-2. If we read this as about people not place, then rather than being contained in a place of safety, the people themselves are a place of safety. But angels guard the gates, and nothing impure will ever enter it. Rev 21.27. There is always an open welcome. But this is received by repentance, forgiveness, and cleansing that comes through the death of Jesus for us. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. Rev 21.13. Where ancient cities had gates usually only on one side, this city can be accessed from every direction. There is no limit to the different ways in which people can join to become part of the people of God. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. Rev 21.18. The mention of jasper again symbolizes the character of God, but the image of gold consistently represents faith, sometimes in the context of being purified through testing, often by persecution. See 1 Cor 3.12, 1 Peter 1.7, and especially Rev 3.18. Gold as pure as glass might then symbolize a people with pure faith and absolute trust in God, perfectly refined by having come through the most severe of tests. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl, Rev 21:22. Within the text, these pearls are a counterpoint to the pearls worn by the harlot Babylon, Revernated 17.4. And within John's context, this refers to the ostentatious delight taken by the extremely wealthy in pearls, which were valued more highly than diamonds. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it, Rev 21.24. As I mentioned above, this resonates with Jesus' teaching to his followers that, "You are the light of the world," Matt 5.14. But John goes further. Not only does the wise and illuminating presence of God amongst and in his people shed light on the whole world, his people are even hospitable to the best that the wider world has to offer, the splendor of the kings of the earth. Taken as a whole, the nations seem to be constantly opposed to God and his people. They trample the holy city 11:2. They are angry with God 11:18. They were seduced by the great prostitute 14:8. 18:3, and deceived by the magical spells of her prosperity 18:23. They are deceived by Satan and make war with the Lamb in the final battle 19:15. 20:8. And yet, from the beginning, Jesus is the rightful Lord over them 1:5, 12:5, and shares his authority with his followers 2:26, and God is King of the nations 15:3. Finally, if we read the imagery personally rather than architecturally, then the water of life signifying the gift of the Spirit flows not so much through a city as through God's people, and the fruit of the tree of life grows in them, and it is their foliage that provides healing. But what difference might it make to us now, in practice? Some readers of Rev 21 want to take it in quite a realized way as a description of the present reality of the church, or at least what the church might be in the present. I think Simon Woodman, in his SCM core text, reads it in this way. I don't find that persuasive, due to the strongly future perspective that these chapters have, in contrast to the earlier parts of the book. But it does offer us a picture of what we are heading to, so that, even if this will never be fully realized in this age, we at least begin to see signs of this, and it might shape our ambitions for what we are in the process of becoming. What it might mean is that God is seeking to form us into a people in his likeness, who are transparent in our integrity and have nothing to hide. We become a safe place for others to find refuge. We constantly are open to welcome people in, of every kind, coming from every direction, but at the same time there is nothing evil or unclean to be found in our midst. Since the Spirit of God is forming us in holiness and purity, we are shaped by both the story of Israel, which has become our story, and the apostolic testimony to the life and truth of Jesus. Our faith, that is, our complete trust in God, has been purified to perfection by faithfulness in the face of trials and difficulties, so that our trust in God is without flaw. As a community, we are marked by the wisdom of the ages, and we offer a place of hospitality to all that is best in the world around us. People of all faiths, and none look to us for wisdom, integrity, and insight. In one sense, there is nothing new here. All these remarkable ambitions can be found elsewhere in the Scriptures. But John's direct and striking imagery, doing theology through architecture, gives a new edge to this sparkling vision. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. Jerusalem did not fall into chaos today, but something far more unsettling happened. The ground shook in ways instruments barely caught. Ancient stones shifted, while modern towers stood. A column of light rose over the Temple Mount, and a heavy gray sky pressed down on a city that suddenly felt watched, measured, and warned at the same time. This was not a random earthquake, not just strange weather. It struck prophetic ground with surgical precision, stirred layers of buried history, and collided with a moment when temple preparations, red heifers, and talk of a new altar were already on the edge of reality. Before we go further, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because what we are witnessing is not the end, but the opening warnings. It did not begin with a siren, an alert on a phone, or a red line on a seismic chart. It began with a feeling of low, rising pressure deep beneath Jerusalem, followed by a jolt that seemed to grab the city from below and shake it awake. Witnesses from the old city to the surrounding hills describe the same sequence. First, a heavy stillness, then a thunder-like groan under their feet, and finally, a burst of movement that sent lamps swaying, shelves rattling, and old stone walls flexing, as if they were breathing for the first time in centuries. There was no gradual build-up, no series of smaller tremors to warn anyone. The shaking arrived almost fully formed, violent, focused, and then suddenly gone. Reports did not stay inside Israel. Tremors were felt as far as Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, reminding everyone that the fault lines running through this land do not respect modern borders and never have. Yet what disturbed many was not just the radius of the shaking, but how the impact seemed to concentrate around Jerusalem itself, striking a city already loaded with history, tension, and prophecy. Residents speak of the shock in two layers. The first shock was physical. Floors shifting, walls creaking, children crying as windows buzzed in their frames. The second came in the silence that followed, a silence so abrupt that it felt intentional, as though a hand had knocked once, hard, and then waited to see who would respond. Scientists, for their part, are cautious. Preliminary readings note an event without the usual foreshocks, without a long chain of escalating activity, and with a pattern of impact that raises more questions than it answers. Officials are quick to calm the public, to use words like manageable and localized, but for those who felt the ground roar beneath them, language like that does not erase the memory of how fast it began and how fast it stopped. In Scripture, earthquakes are rarely just background noise. They are often described as moments when God's voice bypasses debate and human commentary, shaking not only buildings but assumptions. For many in Jerusalem, this event felt less like random seismic stress and more like a sudden, piercing interruption, the kind that forces a city and a watching world to ask, if the ground under the holy city can break its silence this quickly, what else that we thought was stable might be closer to shaking than we realize? As data began to arrive, one detail stood out. This was not a shapeless jolt spread evenly across the land. The lines of impact seemed to trace a path not through the newest districts of Jerusalem, but through its oldest, most theologically loaded ground. Preliminary mapping placed the strongest shaking along a corridor that mirrors the known fault structures around the Mount of Olives. A ridge, already recognized by geologists as vulnerable due to fractured limestone, hidden cavities, and slope instability. In other words, the place long associated with prayer, prophecy, and the footsteps of Jesus is also, in a very real sense, sitting on a system that is ready to move. On the surface, the pattern was hard to ignore. Reports of cracked alleys, shifted tombstones, and warped stone steps surged from the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, and the lanes feeding into the Old City, while many modern neighborhoods with their steel, glass, and fresh foundations emerged with far lighter damage. Engineers pointed to construction standards, soil composition, and the fact that the old city rests on layers of debris rather than solid bedrock, making it more vulnerable when the ground lurches. Their explanation is not wrong, but for those who walked the streets afterward, it felt incomplete. To many locals, it seemed as if the shaking had chosen the ancient stones, the pilgrimage paths, the historic walls, the places people have prayed and wept over for generations. The word that began to circulate was not random, but selective, as if something had reached into the map of Jerusalem and pressed firmly on the oldest scars first. For believers who know the text of Zechariah 14:4, the imagery was impossible to ignore. The prophecy speaks of a day when the Lord's feet stand on the Mount of Olives and the mountain splits from east to west, forming a great valley language that suddenly feels less abstract when fresh cracks have just traced their way across that same ridge. Scientists, again, speak of coincidence, a seismic event, a vulnerable slope, an unfortunate overlap between geology and history. But for many in Jerusalem, the question will not go away. If this was only coincidence, why did so much of the force fall on the very ground that scripture, memory, and expectation have been circling for thousands of years? Perhaps over time, the people of Israel have come to understand that whether events from their ancestors' time or the events that follow, they all appear to be deliberately coincidental. And, more importantly, not all movement that matters comes with a spike on a chart. In the days after the main shaking, residents began to notice something far slower, stranger, and harder to classify. The city seemed to be shifting in ways that instruments barely registered, but eyes and feet could no longer ignore. Along certain roads near older ridges, asphalt that once lay flat now carried a gentle but visible curve, as if a hidden hand had pushed from beneath. Stone paths that pilgrims had walked for decades no longer met edge to edge. Gaps opened between once tight blocks, and some slabs tilted just enough that water began to pool where it had never collected before. None of this came with the sharp jolt of a new quake. There were no fresh sirens, no urgent updates, only the quiet testimony of misaligned stones and subtle drops in familiar steps. Engineers speak of slow ground deformation, of soft layers undercutting harder ones, of slopes that have been accumulating stress for years and now rearrange themselves millimeter by millimeter. On paper, it can be modeled and explained. In person, it feels like the city is breathing uneasily, like a structure that has begun to lean just enough for everyone inside to sense that something is off, even if nothing has collapsed. What unsettles observers most is not dramatic disaster, but this silent instability. The tremor passes and people expect normal to return, yet the evidence underfoot says the opposite. Alignment is loosening, pressure is still working, and what once felt anchored has begun to drift. It is the difference between a door slammed open and a foundation quietly sinking. One shocks for a moment, the other changes everything over time. For those who read the prophets, this slow, deliberate unsteadiness echoes the language of Isaiah 24:20, where the earth is said to reel like a drunkard, swaying like a fragile hut under the weight of its own guilt. The picture is not of instant annihilation, but of a world losing its balance, staggering before it falls. In Jerusalem, the bending roads and shifting stones have become a living parable of that image, a reminder that sometimes judgment does not shout. It leans, presses, and waits, giving just enough time for people to recognize that their stability was never as solid as they believed. The shaking might have been enough on its own. But what pushed this event from unsettling into deeply disturbing? For many witnesses were the things that appeared when the ground finally went, still not beneath their feet, but above their heads and within the stones themselves. On more than one evening after the quake, people in and around the old city reported a column of pale, concentrated light forming over the Temple Mount. It did not spread like normal glow, did not flicker like lightning, and did not sweep like a search beam. It stood almost vertical, a narrow shaft of radiance hovering above the dome of the rock before retracting upward and vanishing, as if it had been pulled back into the sky.